female to head the African Union. That's not the first talking point on the African continent itself. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma's election as chair of the AU marks a victory for a continental powerhouse. We're talking about South Africa. The 63-year-old Home Affairs Minister, a seasoned politician, ex-wife to that country's current president, Jacob Zuma. The English-speaking unseating Francophone Jean Ping of Gabon. Linguistic and regional rivalries now must be put aside. Dlamini-Zuma's got a long to-do list waiting for her, starting with the Great Lakes region, where the leaders at the AU summit have struck a deal that calls for African Union peacekeepers to help patrol eastern Congo. Getting the leaders of Sudan and South Sudan to shake hands at that summit is also a good cause to celebrate and a reminder, a half-century after most of the AU members got their independence, that it's tricky business calling into question old colonial boundaries. Is Dlamini-Zuma the right woman to sort out the continent's challenges? And is South Africa the right country to mediate? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking who's in charge when it comes to the African continent. And we hope to be joined soon from that African Union summit in the Ethiopian capital by Clayson Manyela of the South African Foreign Affairs Ministry. With us here in the studio, Sabine CESSOU of Slate Africa, who lived in South Africa. Thank you for being with us. Also with us, Douglas Yates, the American University, author of Oil, Rebel Movements and Armed Conflict in Africa. Also joining us from Lagos, Tunde FATUNDE, columnist for The Guardian newspaper there. Welcome back, sir. The France 24 debate, where you can always weigh in on the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. A lot of you have been joining in with their thoughts, are addressed there at François F24. I am not an English speaker, I'm a Zulu speaker. That was the quip by Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, dismissing the Anglophone-Francophone divide after her election as head of the AU. Dlamini-Zuma, who now becomes the face of the African Unit Secretariat.
Already a trailblazer in her native South Africa, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma is breaking new ground as the first woman to lead the African Union. One of her country's longest-serving government ministers, she's also the former wife of President Jacob Zuma. As a young woman, the 63-year-old was an active member of the anti-apartheid movement. She studied medicine at an English university and in 1994 was appointed health minister by Nelson Mandela, South Africa's first black president. She was criticized in that position for championing an ineffective AIDS drug, but remembered for overhauling the country's healthcare system. She served as Foreign Affairs Minister from 1999 to 2009 and has since been Minister of Home Affairs. Just before being elected, Dlamini-Zuma criticized the unwritten tradition that the AU chair not come from one of Africa's major powers.
It's not fair to citizens of this continent to say you can only contribute to the African Union if you come from a small country. If you come from a big country, you can't.
Voting was mostly split along linguistic lines, with the English-speaking countries of the EU backing her and the French-speaking supporting incumbent Jean Ping. Dlamini-Zuma will serve as chairperson of the AU Commission for a 4-year term.
All right, the Francophones and the Anglophones divided. Sabine CESSOU, the South African press today, delighted that it was one of their own. And of course, as you saw in that report, she's a familiar face and a woman with a long history in politics.
She is. She's been a minister in all the South African governments since the ANC is in power, since 1994. She doesn't have a very good track record on delivery, but that's a global problem for South African politicians. But she's very well respected in the political circles for her ability to run organizations and to reform organizations. Otherwise, she's very attached to African traditions and values, and she's well liked for the fact that she's wearing African garments very often.
You were saying she's attached to this traditional values. When she was married to Jacob Zuma, it was in a polygamous marriage.
Also, yes, because she didn't hesitate to go into a polygamous marriage, even though she was a very modern lady. She had a degree in medicine, and she went in Swaziland, met Jacob Zuma, and decided on the ground of Zulu tradition to share her life with a a man and another woman, a
All right.
first wife.
And as you saw in that report, it's been pitted as Anglophone South African who wins over a Francophone Gabonese. But it's not just the Francophones that are upset. This is the interesting bit. Kenya supported Jean Ping's re-election bid. The French news agency quotes an assistant foreign affairs minister who says, "I'm very uncomfortable with the methods and style of South Africa. They were entitled to bring a candidate, but we felt there was too much intimidation, arm twisting, and threats." Douglas Yates, what happened here? The fact that, so what if it is a South African who runs the AU? Why does that make countries uneasy, and even Anglophone countries like Kenya?
Well, the Organization of African Unity, now which we call the AU, has a long history that came out of decolonization. And as a country would get its freedom, it would join. And when it was created, there was another vision for Africa, which was a Pan-African vision. And because that failed, there's been this sort of compromise international organization. And in order to prevent the larger powers from dominating this otherwise feeble institutionalization, they set some informal rules. Now, there are a couple countries on the African continent which are acting like regional hegemons. In West Africa, it's Nigeria. They also opposed South Africa's move. And in East Africa, I mean, Kenya is probably the most valid power you'd have. Many of the countries in the region are basket cases. And in South Africa, therefore, is been presenting itself as a regional hegemon. It's been dominating, for example, the South African Defense Community, SADC, which is the regional organization for Southern Africa. And it's been very difficult for smaller countries, for example, Namibia, to find its way in the South African-dominated organization. So I think one of the fears is that now that this line has been crossed, the AU, post-Gaddafi, could find itself with a new leader. And South Africa is a country that could play that role.
Because Gaddafi used to be one of the big benefactors of the organization itself.
That's right. Libya, in fact, had ambitions of creating a new structure in Africa with Libya at the top. It's that kind of hegemonic design that I think some of the other countries are uncomfortable with.
Tunde Fatunde, are you uncomfortable with a South African at the head of the AU?
Well, we're going to wait and see what happens with Zuma, Madam Zuma heading the African Union organization, because there's a written rule that big countries must not be allowed to head that organization. Now South Africa has broken that general consensus. We are yet to see if other countries would support her. She is on a very, very tight rope.
Is it a big rivalry between Nigeria, the most populous state in sub-Saharan Africa, and South Africa, the richest one?
No, not rivalry. You see, South Africa is just under 10 years old as an post-apartheid country. Nigeria formed the OAU and also is the leading power in ECOWAS, West Africa. And Nigeria is the largest financial contributor to ECOWAS. And from the records, Nigeria has really played down its leadership role so that the smaller countries will not feel either marginalized, humiliated, or intimidated. We want to see if that will not be the case with Madam Zuma from South Africa at the head of the Pan-African organization.
Sabine CESSOU, why did South Africa, in your view, lobby so hard for the job? Remember, there was 6 months ago, they voted a first time. It was a hung vote. She unseated the sitting chair of the African Union, Jean Ping, a respected diplomat across the continent. Why did South Africa aggressively chase the job?
For 2 reasons or 3 reasons. I think the first one is that it's only justice for South Africa to have a leading role on the continent after so many years of isolation, international isolation. Remember, during apartheid, South Africa was living itself as a remote country. And when you were saying north, we are going north in South Africa, it meant Zimbabwe. So for the South African politicians and for the culture of the ANC, it's very important to have the adequate role that's corresponding with the political weight and the economical weight of South Africa.
Even though it was nearly 2 decades ago that apartheid fell?
Yes, I think so. I think the other reason is that South Africa has joined the group BRICS, the emerging countries, and this group is lobbying very much to have a restructuration, a deep restructuration and redistribution of power within the international organization. And with that AU...
At the UN Security Council, most notably.
And with that seat at the African Union, things might change. I mean, it's for South Africa on the global point of view, it's a big step forward.
So that's the bigger prize, a seat at the Security Council.
I think that would be their ambition. Perhaps they'll find themselves, however, being forced to be identified with a series of AU failures. The problem with the AU is it doesn't have much money, it really doesn't have a standing army, and South Africa is going to be on the front line. When it was Jean Ping representing Gabon, no one expected much. But now there'll be great expectations, and if South Africa takes strong positions, it'll be expected to fork out some of the money and perhaps even some of the troops. So this could be a double-edged sword.
All right, let's go to some of those expectations. What's top of her to-do list is a question we put to you on the France 24 Debate Facebook page. Our good friend Eric Ollender wrote, Africa lacks a strong regional political force, and the AU should step up to play that role. The African Union as such right now, Sabine, you agree with what Eric says, is not a political force as such?
The African Union is in a mess, basically. It has really done nothing much during the past crisis, the past very deep crisis that the African continent has gone through. When you look at Ivory Coast, when you look at Libya, when you look at Mali, African Union is making people laugh on the continent because they don't have a vision, they don't have a stance, they don't have a cohesion, they don't have something that's unifying, and they don't have a political vision, actually.
FATUNDE, do you agree?
Well, I think to some extent I do agree. Don't forget that African Union, just like European Union, is a union based on several states, and they must reach consensus over every issue on the continent. Don't forget that African Union was divided over the Libyan issue. African Union was also divided over the crisis in Cote d'Ivoire. African Union is still trying to find its feet concerning the crisis in Mali and its implications on the entire continent. So African Union is a union based on consensus. Consensus does not mean unified vision. It simply means unified consensual vision. So from that point of view, Madam Zuma would simply be in a position to harmonize the views of the 53 African states when it comes to regional and international issues. So she has a lot of task on her hands.
Now let me ask you, Tunde, for instance, with the conflict in Ivory Coast, there was unanimity when it came to how the West African body, ECOWAS, acted. Do you think that with a South African in charge of the African Union now, it means that South Africa is going to more and more impose its will in things that happen in your part of Africa?
Well, I think Madam Zuma needs to be extremely very careful in dealing with continental issues, in the sense that before he can take any action, don't forget that structurally Africa is divided into 4 broad regional integrating units: North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. Now, Madam Zuma must make sure that before she takes any view on, for example, West Africa, she must consult the member states in that region so that those states will not look at her as trying to impose South African view on ECOWAS. It has happened before. And so she needs to be extremely very, very careful. East Africa also, she needs to consult with the regional leaders before saying, look, this is a consensual position of African Union. If she goes ahead to behave as if she is promoting South African strategic vital interests, I am very sure it may backfire.
Now, on our Facebook page, a couple of more reactions when we asked again what should be the top of the to-do list. Michael from Harare said, focus on bringing stability as Western, Central, and Eastern Africa continue to be conflict hotspots. Gosh, that nearly covers the whole continent. Michael on Twitter says, I would say without a doubt that the continued destabilization by Rwanda of the Democratic Republic of Congo should be your top priority. Not holding my breath, though. Now, there is some measure of good news when it comes to what's going on there. Remember, a couple weeks ago, Kinshasa, based on a leaking or a report from the United Nations that directly points the finger at Rwanda when it comes to a new rebel group that's come out of Eastern Congo. The good piece of good news, and again, this comes from that AU summit that's taking place today. The leaders of Rwanda and DR Congo agreeing to have UN and AU peacekeepers patrol there. Already the UN has peacekeepers who've redeployed over to Goma from where they were further north to try and stop a rebel advance, one that's forced 100,000 from their homes since the spring. A reinforced AU-UN presence, but more importantly, the AU. What does that add to the equation?
Well, South Africa has a major role to play in the Democratic Republic of the Congo because South Africa is the one that brought that country into SADC, which is a defense community. The Southern African Defense Community. So in this particular crisis, a Southern African is actually well positioned to behave, to act. Bringing together the two key parties, Rwanda, which many people think of as a small country because its territory looks small, but militarily is like Sparta in the region. Rwanda is a key actor. Many people, in fact, have accused Rwanda of informally colonizing this region. The recent action by the international community there is to protect Tutsi populations, and Rwanda will do that. Rwanda is ruled by a Tutsi government. On the other hand, South Africa's got an interlocutor in the government in Kinshasa, that is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. South Africa has a lot that it can play with that relationship through the defense community. So here, this is good news. Clearly, any way that we can demilitarize or remilitarize in a security fashion the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo will create security for civilians who are on the verge of massacre and massacre.
All right, I want Sabine CESSOU's reaction to this, but first, we got to take a break. We'll be right back. You're watching the France 24 debate.